All right. I think we're live. Do we have the slides we can put up real quick? All right. There we go. Awesome. Well, I just wanted to say thanks for everyone being here and attending this webinar today. I think it's good that everybody's getting in and we're able to kind of sit and talk through stuff. So I guess we'll go ahead and jump right in. We'll do some quick intros here. Liz, would you mind introducing yourself real quick?
Yeah, sure, Stephen. So Liz Martin, I'm our global technical lead for Threat Intel here at Dragos. Been here the last 3.5 years. Prior to that, was doing cyber defense operations in government.
Gotcha. I'm Steve Holtzclaw. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here with Broadleaf. Been doing IT and cybersecurity for more years than I have fingers and toes, and looking forward to talking to you guys about the upcoming trends and things we're seeing in the OT security space. And we'll kind of go through and hopefully there's some actionable information you guys take away from this. And all right, let's get started. Perfect. So I guess we'll hop down into slide 2 and go from there. All right. So what are some of the observations that Dragos has had over the last 12 months? I know it's been a very busy time for y'all, and this is kind of a major emerging trend of different threat actors and things along those lines. So just kind of curious what you guys have been seeing over the last 12 months.
Yeah, for sure. So we're constantly each year after year adding new threat groups, and it's not for fun. It's because there's legitimately new threats out there. You'll even see we use some unique nomenclature here. So the funny icons you see on the screen are the different threat groups that Dragos tracks. And we don't use it to be cute or cheeky in any sense. We actually use these names to delineate between what are actual OT threats to ICS OT versus those that you may be used to seeing on the IT side. So we name all of our threat groups after rare earth minerals. And as you can see over the past year, we've added 2 new additional groups, one of which we'll talk quite a bit about today, known as bauxite, so that BX that you see, as well as another group known as graphite, that's the GR.
Gotcha. Yeah, so some of the stuff that we're seeing with Broadleaf and our customers is there definitely seems to be an uptick, specifically around OT threats. And then kind of tying into that is it seems like boards as well as cybersecurity insurance companies are starting to actually pay attention to these trends and these things that are happening and the unfortunate events that are tied to them. Um, we're seeing increased requirements from cyber vendors basically saying, hey, if you want to be able to actually get this cybersecurity insurance for your manufacturing company or your oil and gas company, any of those types of things, you need to have the certain tools, techniques, and processes in place to be able to actually defend from some of these threats and actually have an architecture that helps guarantee that there's not just easy open targets for these folks to go in and exploit. So are there certain things that y'all can do to help cover some of those requirements? Is there, that's specifically on y'all's wheelhouse?
Yeah, absolutely. And great question. We at Dragos try to meet all of our customers and prospects where they are in their OT cybersecurity journey. And we do work with a number of the insurance providers that are out there, and they're trying to understand what does the threat landscape look like. So they're trying to take that same approach that we take and say, okay, what can Dragos tell us about the threat landscape? And then they prepare their insurance policies, let's say, based off of those key threat trends we're seeing or the threat vectors that are being accessed by bad actors, to then say to the end client, whether that's a manufacturer or otherwise, these are the key things you need to be working towards or striving towards, or here are the key milestones to build a defensible architecture and what that looks like. So at the end of the day, we're trying to work across something called the 5 critical controls for industrial control systems and operational technology. And it's something you'll hear us refer to throughout the presentation here today, because it's really the 5 easiest things you could do from the get-go to start chipping away at what are your milestones. Do you have an OT specific incident response plan? Do you have a defensible architecture? And we'll get into some of the other components later on, but you'll see that as a trend throughout the presentation here.
I gotcha. Yeah, I know that in quite a few of our organizations that we've been helping, being able to understand what they actually have in their architecture and then understanding which components to plug in along the way is a really large part of that. The bigger thing is kind of just a general awareness around what they need to be doing from not just an IT or OT perspective, but involving the rest of the organization. And some of the things that we've been doing is trying to hold these kind of roundtables or simulations of events where we can actually pull in other parts of the organization. It's like legal has a role in these type of things when you're going through an incident response plan, right? Like they have to be able to understand what they need to do. your marketing group needs to understand what they need to do. And there's all these different areas and components of the business that all have to kind of play together. And that's one of those areas where I see, that's when you kind of tie in consulting practices, or you tie in products such as Dragos, where this deep expertise, where they have this knowledge to be able to go and talk about these things with more than just the technical leadership of the business. It's really powerful and really helps kind of get a better understanding through the whole company.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things I've personally seen a lot with the clients we've dealt with across various industries that works really well is what you just hinted at, is that collaborative approach is bringing both teams together to be able to collaborate across. It's not just an IT problem or an OT problem. It's having to reach across both of those, especially when we talk about areas of manufacturing and just the overall sheer connectedness within those environments.
Oh yeah, and that's only going to continue to grow, right? More and
Yeah.
more things are going to be tied together. It's that whole digital transformation thing that we've all been trying to work on for the last 20 plus years, and it took a worldwide pandemic to really push it in that direction, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, let's hop on to the next slide. So this one's really kind of focusing more. You kind of mentioned a little bit about bauxite, but this also is kind of diving into a little bit of the other areas, what we're seeing, and especially if you've been on social media, you've seen this one image posted up on social media where it's threat actors basically taking over this HMI that's at a water treatment plant. So hack division seems to be a thing these days, right? So kind of my questions are, what are y'all seeing? What are these fingerprints that kind of differentiate or even kind of align some of these counterparts? Like, how's this playing in your space, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I try to break it into three categories, right? So when I look at threat activity, the three bins, I kind of bin them in, even though realistically they're all kind of working hand in hand, which I'll get into here in a second. Is you have your nation state backed type groups. While we stay away from attribution at Dragos, that's more of a government game per se. Those are the types of groups you can think of that are backed by a large nation state, your Russia, your China, Iran, Korea, so on and so forth. And then in that second bin, you have what are considered hacktivist groups, as Stephen mentioned. So bauxite being one of those we'll talk about today. They're more opportunistic in nature, and they've grown a bit more bold, which we'll talk about today, over the last couple of years, where we see them causing actual effects to OT environments versus before it was just hacking for the fun of it. Now there's a bit more intention behind what they're doing. And then the third bin or category, which we'll talk later on about, is more of the ransomware category. When we talk about some of the convergence between the nation state activity and the hacktivist activity, and even bundling in some of that ransomware activity later on, the key trend we're seeing here is a lot of intelligence collaboration, which means sharing of intel. It's extremely easy for anyone to go on the computer right now and look up, common CVEs that are out there, and then drill down into specific vendors, devices, so on and so forth. And taking it one step further and saying, what has an active vulnerability on it that has a public proof of concept that's being actively exploited. Or even taking it even one step further and saying, let me do some open source scanning to see what devices pop up on the internet. These are all things we've seen these actors do. And I think the worst part about this is once they're in these environments, in the OT, they're looking to exfil very sensitive data, whether that's intellectual property or something specific to the network architecture, to target additional sites or to do some more strategic targeting or reconnaissance further. And they're looking to kind of up level their game with the more data that they can exfil. So they put that on shared resources and sites that other actors can then go to and use that same information to further their targeting objectives. So you can see how that just becomes a cascading problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that when we've been talking back and forth over the last month and a half, 2 months, as we were kind of scoping this call, it's one of the pieces that kind of really stood out to me is like the amount of collaboration that these different organizations have is actually pretty impressive, right? It's something where you go back 10, 15 years, people even in the IT space didn't really want to share what was going on inside of their organizations with other companies and organizations because they didn't want to give up the trade secrets. And also, if they've been breached, if they've had issues, they didn't want to sit and talk about it. And here we are, the people that we're trying to defend against are open sourcing this information, for lack of a better word, and saying, here, I was able to go get in XYZ company. Why don't you all go do see what you can do? It's interesting to me. And it's a different approach that I think maybe some of the things we can actually learn from these threat actors that we should be doing ourselves, right? I always kind of make the joke a little bit about IT security is like people attending an AA meeting, right? It's they want to kind of keep things all close and bundled up, and it's okay to share. Like you need to talk to your peers, you need to talk to these user groups and forums and kind of participate in these meetings so that you can share the knowledge because our adversaries are absolutely doing it. And it's something where we have to kind of learn from them in that perspective and say, all right, yeah, maybe it's not so bad that I actually admit that we had an issue somewhere along the way. And then somebody might even be able to give you a solution for a problem that you're trying to figure out, trying to solve for. So
Yeah,
just definitely interesting.
to that end, when we get into that information sharing piece and collaborating with your peers, that's where we've seen a lot of fruitful conversations occur with clients, whether they're in the same industry or similar industries. You see victim overlaps being coordinated here between the different threat groups. And to them, it really doesn't, frankly, matter industry or region. They're really looking at what technologies can I target. And
Yeah,
while a PLC can be OEM specific, a PLC is a PLC at the end of the day. So
exactly. The ladder logic's different, but it's the same thing.
exactly. If they can string together, okay, I can target XYZ and hit a larger number of folks, they're going to do that. So to your point, Stephen, being able to have that knowledge transfer, sharing with peers of lessons learned, different challenges that maybe the same exact challenges others are having goes a long way in trying to get towards a resilient cybersecurity posture for a lot of these clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've touched on it a couple times, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about our new folks bauxite that we've got out there.
Yeah, for sure. So Bauxite's an interesting group. If you all are familiar with or have heard of the Cyber Avengers hacktivist group, that's how we're tracking the campaigns and activity under this umbrella group known as Bauxite. So for all intents and purposes, it shares technical overlaps with the Cyber Avengers group. And we saw a number of exploitation campaigns emerge from this group over the last year and a half, 2 years now. And originally there was a major focus on water, wastewater utilities. And again, this is where we get into some of that. Okay, we're hyper focused on that. So I'm going to discount this as a threat because it's only focused on water, wastewater at the present time. And what we saw quickly emerge there was expanded targeting aperture. And again, this goes to that note I made about a PLC is a PLC at the end of the day. So one of the major campaigns that they decided to run was against Unitronics PLCs. It was a very public campaign, reported on very widely by press. And again, started in the utility space. And then we slowly started to see that build out into a larger campaign where they were going after a brewery in Pittsburgh, of all places, right? So we started to see that expansion there in the targeting aperture. And we've seen a number of other things from this group as far as potential manipulation of ladder logic within a PLC. Because of some of the techniques that they're using to manipulate some of the devices that they're going after. And the reality is, again, a lot of these groups aren't doing anything trivial by nature. They're really going after low-hanging fruit to target the environments they're trying to get into.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, the first I heard a little bit about bauxite, obviously, other than on the news and the press and everything that you mentioned, is I was hearing some chatter from folks that I knew that were in Europe that are previous colleagues and things along those lines. And I know it really started there, especially with the conflict in the Middle East and everything that's going on. It seems to boil over, and then they seem to be the first recipients of some of these things that are going on. But there's definitely a lot of stuff that we as practitioners can do to really try to help protect against some of that stuff. And we'll touch a little bit on the next slide and hop into that one. And the thing that stood out to me that when we were talking about this previously is, and don't put your critical assets directly on the internet. Have good cyber hygiene. Like the majority of the way these folks are getting in, it's the same kind of song and dance that we've heard from the wastewater controls of the water treatment plant that was in the United States that got compromised. And basically somebody took over a team viewer instance and said, you know what, I'm going to put 400% more chlorine in the water, right? Well, it's just because they had the thing publicly facing on the internet. Have the hygiene that you need to have. And it's such a important part of what we need to do as we're trying to go through and protect these assets, because you're 100% right. There's open source tools out there. You've got Shodan that'll show vulnerabilities and assets that are on the internet, and it's actively scanning all these sites and targets. And then even resources that we use when we go through and do pen tests or any type of actual, kind of more blue hat, purple hat activities, you're using Kali toolset, and they're using the same thing against us, right? So it's just one of those things where if you're having the right level of protection in the beginning and trying to make your architecture more defensible, which we've talked about in several different ways, have these layers of the onion, so to speak, and don't just say, okay, here's my control system, go have fun with it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, on that note, we saw last year a particular incident where we had a client that was in the middle of an incident response. They had 28 of their 33 firewalls being actively exploited by cyber avengers, aka Bauxite. And we were kind of going up against, you know, what's the name and game here? They were targeting Sophos and Fortinet firewalls, some vulnerabilities within those devices. They hadn't been patched. They've just been sitting on, frankly, these rigs that were sitting out in the middle of nowhere that weren't being watched or managed by anybody. And nobody had any idea that these were just hanging out there, right? That's really the name and game for a group like this. And a lot of the groups are kind of doing the same thing. They're targeting those internet facing devices. To your point, you don't want those things sitting out there on the internet because people, bad actors, are doing open source scanning, trying to find those. And really, the take home here is not just they're getting to the device, but they have the ability to cause impact. We've seen them shut down operations within ICS OT over the past 2 years in a number of instances, as I mentioned. And this is really walking through that kind of staged attack, if you will. So when we talk about stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain, that's where we're not just developing out the attack and initiating any reconnaissance, but we're actually delivering on the attack. In this case, we're actually
Yeah.
putting and implementing malware and trying to change logic in a PLC and things of that nature, where this group is trying to cause a denial of service in the device. So
Yeah, I mean, they're basically taking the foothold wherever they can get it, right? It's either through a non-patch device, something that's directly on the internet that shouldn't, it's not a security appliance, something along those lines. And then they're chaining these attacks together, right? So they're coming in the environment and then they're obviously pivoting to other aspects of it. It's not just a single thing. It's like, okay, well, we're not going to just go modify this one PLC. Once they have a better picture and a better understanding of the entire environment, they're going to go in and try to exploit whatever they can, right? It's the same thing that we see in the IT side of the world, where we're basically having people with dwell time of many, many months as they go in and actually learn the architecture and the infrastructure that's there so they can be even more destructive, for lack of a better word, when they finally do decide to release the payload that they've got saved up for people.
yeah, exactly. And as we continue on here, I think I just want to kind of instill out to the audience that this isn't about fear mongering. You know, there's all these scary bad actors out there. Sure, there's bad actors out there. But again, what they're doing is really not special or trivial by any means. Sure, when you get into the malware aspects, there can be some unique malware strings that they come up with, some unique packages in that way. But when we talk about how they're actually getting initial access, they're not doing anything special or secret. And it really does go back to that kind of cyber resilience, doing the basics and cyber hygiene aspects.
Exactly. It's just about making sure that you go through the basic parts of trying to protect what you have. And that's something that we'll share in commonality between the IT cyber part of the house and the OT cyber part of the house. There's tools and techniques and processes that do apply in both. And that's really one of the things that's kind of interesting is, a lot of companies, I alluded to this earlier, are starting to have more of that IT presence in the OT side of the space, especially around the technology that's being used there and how to protect those assets. And really just following the same type of methodology that we do to make sure that you're taking care of the IT side of the house. You can say 80%, 70% apply. So you have to be a little bit more careful about it, because if you interrupt a critical process, then you're, losing money for your business, or worst case scenario, I mean, you can have actual repercussions that are not financial. You can cause loss of life incidents. You can cause other things that happen. So you have to have a good perspective around what you're working in, and really team up and partner with the folks that live in the OT side of the world, right? It's not just hey, well, we bought this one antivirus toolkit, we're going to roll that out on all your SCADA servers and your HMI, and we're not going to worry about what it does. It's just gonna work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think on that note of disruption to operations and potential revenue loss, we hear a lot about ransomware, right? And I even made the comment to you yesterday. I made the comment to an actual manufacturer this morning we were talking to, where, I know everybody in the room is going to roll their eyes as soon as they hear ransomware. I just kind of feel it actually come through. And it's
Yep.
because we heard about it for years and years and years. And while it feels like that belabored topic we consistently talk about, it is a topic of concern. It is something that people should care about because it is happening. When we look at actual metrics and stats around some incident responses we've done over the past year, specifically around ransomware, and for the most part in the manufacturing space, we ran into a number of incidents, 25% to be exact, that resulted in full shutdown of ICS OT operations. So again, talking about revenue loss, depending on how much downtime that can cascade. And then on the other side of that, we had about 75% of those attacks result in partial shutdown or partial disruption of operations. So that's still some staggering metrics. And again, we're still talking about actual disruption. On a weekly basis, Dragos puts out about 50 or more incidents we see globally regarding ransomware activity, and we find the victims on dedicated leak sites. So that goes back to the point we talked about earlier. A lot of that victim overlap, victim sharing of information, intelligence gathering. So what they're doing is effectively getting into these environments. They're exfilling the data from these environments. And when they're able to exfil, they're going to push that out more broadly. And that's exactly what other more sophisticated actors are looking for to further their targeting objectives. So that's really kind of the take home here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of one of these things where you look at these metrics and it's like almost 1,700 incidents last year. And kind of the way I look at that is I'm shocked, but I'm not shocked, right? This is something that we've been dealing with, oh, I don't know, for the better part of 15 years at this point. I mean, you go way back in time, there's been different versions of, cryptography that have been applied to cause disruption in systems, but not to this scale, right? So it's something where even in the broadleaf group, the things that we're actually paying attention to and watching is we're seeing the evolution of these malware groups trying to develop stuff that is a little different from what they've done previously. It's not just a warmable malware like we all had to deal with WannaCry. It's people are taking and abusing tools. Like, and for instance, we're seeing quite a big prevalence of cloud ransomware being developed. And fundamentally what they're doing, these threat actors, they're going in and writing basic scripts that utilize AWS and Amazon tool sets to say, okay, delete everything in your KMS and then reissue me new keys and then go encrypt all the file systems that you already had marked for encryption in place, right? And then essentially by eliminating the existing keys and issuing new ones, you've locked them out of their environment. So it's a very different thing than somebody actually having to develop an encryption algorithm and then have it mass deploy. I mean, in all honesty, when we were talking at our kickoff, our sales kickoff that we had internally here back in February, I demonstrated through a jailbroke LLM how you can actually have these AI tools be able to generate scripts that do this for you. So it's getting easier and easier, and these guys are sharing knowledge and information. So it's one of those things where, exactly to your point, it's not fear mongering. It's really learning how to be prepared. You have to be able to understand what's going to happen in your environment and ignoring the indicators that are out there and not trying to take the preventative steps ends up putting you in a worse situation. It'd be better off to say, okay, look, I'm just going to acknowledge the fact that at some point in my tenure while I'm here or when I'm in my career, I'm going to have one of these incidents that I'm going to have to deal with. It's not a question of if, it's becoming a question of when. And that's actually kind of giving a little bit more information about my relationship with Dragos and how we all met was over an actual incident that had to be worked for an organization that I was working for. And it was an incident response incident specifically related to ransomware. The environment was ransomware and fundamentally shut down, and it had a whole process to go through to be able to recover and get back in operation. And that's something where, when I came out of being on the client side and back into the consulting side of the world, I really wanted to make sure that I took that experience and that knowledge and shared that with other folks and then partnered up with Dragos because they did such a great job, especially in the IR side of the world, to be able to get us back up and operational and let us know where our issues were and guarantee that we had things cleaned out. So it's you're eventually everybody's going to have to deal with it at some point in time. So it's better to be 100% prepared than not, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like on the front again of that collaborative effort between IT and OT, I mean, I can't tell you how many times we get into a manufacturing environment and it's their first time trying to get visibility and we see thousands and thousands of assets. And one of the very first things that usually pops up from a detections point of view for us is ransomware. And it's one of those things that can go completely dormant in your environment and may not rear its ugly head until the worst possible time. So these are all things to kind of consider as you're looking at your current posture and key milestones you're trying to either work towards or planning to work towards as you build up your security strategy for OT.
Yeah, and I think you touched on an interesting point there too, is as these teams are learning how to collaborate, the thing that's been most beneficial for me just over time as I've started to learn more, a little bit more about the OT side of the world, right? I mean, I didn't originate from that side of the house, right? I was the IT guy that had to figure out how to be able to go in and do these types of things. So when I was a consultant, probably 15 years ago at this point in time, I had a customer that was a chemical engineering facility that was out in further out in Texas, and then one that was out in Plaquemine, Louisiana. And the control system engineer that was there was incredibly intelligent and was really trying to figure out how to be able to solve his rounding problem that he had between these three sites, so he could replicate his Veeam backups of his HMIs and his PLC or his SCADA environment that was there. So he reached out to us. It was a conversation that kind of started off as like, okay, well, can you help me come do this? I'm like, sure. So I show up on site and we're sitting there just kind of getting requirements, understanding what's going on. And me being exposed to an environment that I didn't really know or understand. I mean, you had to wear, steel toe boots, hard hat, fire gear to even be able to get in the facility to have the conversation, right? I was like, okay, yeah, we'll write a scope up. I'll walk you guys through how to do this, but I want to trade. Like the stuff that you're doing and your knowledge specifically around how you're operating these facilities, your control systems mentality, the knowledge that you have, let's share. Like, I'll teach you how to do this stuff if you teach me some of the stuff that you're doing. And what I found to be some of the most powerful way that you can kind of work with the OT folks, the engineers, the plant operators, the folks that live this day in and day out, is to take 15, 20 minutes of your day and go and just have a conversation. Understand what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and learn some of the language, learn some of the lingo about what's going on. And it makes it a million times easier when you want to go sit down there and say, hey, we've got this new stuff that we need to roll out. We need to change some stuff on a firewall to make sure that you don't have your assets exposed on the internet. They'll listen to you because they have a little bit more trust in the fact that you're not just coming in and blanket changing things. It's a good thing to do. It's good to spend time and talk to people and actually understand how they do their normal day-to-day stuff. But kind of tying all that back into ransomware, I mean, for me, can you talk to us a little bit about this kill chain that you've got up here? It's kind of a little interesting graphic.
Yeah, and I think what you alluded to just now ties really well into that as far as not just the connectedness between IT and OT that we see today, but there's a lot of dependencies there, right? You're going to have
Yep.
firewalls you have to deal with. You're going to have segmentation that you have to deal with. And that's frankly where we see a lot of bad actors, specifically in the ransomware bin that I mentioned, doing that initial targeting and how they're getting into the environment. So they're typically coming from IT inbound to OT because there's connectedness there, and not just because there's connectedness, but because there's weak segmentation between those environments. There's improperly configured firewalls or firewall rules in general. And in this case, we're looking at there's some exploited VPN credentials that were weak or default credentials on a device that were targeted by an adversary. They gain admin rights through some misconfigured access in the environment. And then they moved from IT to OT due to that poor segmentation I mentioned, which allows them to then deploy that ransomware. And again, they're encrypting those systems, trying to lock them down, holding you literally ransom, having them try to extort money from you as a payout. And 9 times out of 10, we see a lot of folks who will actually pay the ransom. And in other cases, we see them pay the ransom and the bad actor still exfils the data or takes the data and runs with it.
Exactly.
So there's no winning in those situations, unfortunately. And it's all in how you prepare for those bad days, which is when we talk about how to fix it. How do you go about this? And it starts leaning into the talk of those 5 critical controls we mentioned earlier on in the presentation and sort of weaving that messaging forward here where we talk about how do you build a defensible architecture. And I always say it's going back to the basics. While you can't copy IT tool sets, detection capabilities into OT and make them work, just like you can't copy your IT incident response plan into OT. The two don't mesh. It's two different types of systems, environments, processes, etc. there are basic fundamental things that you will deal with that you can put preventatives in place, can put mitigations in place. Instilling MFA, having multi-factor authentication across the environment, making sure you don't have external assets facing the internet from OT. And if you do, making sure you have visibility across the communications of those devices, what's talking inbound, outbound. If you have that requirement for automation, which we know in manufacturing is universal, automation is everything in those environments. So
Oh
understanding
yeah.
those aspects, right? And having that level of visibility is highly important. Being able to monitor in and out access to the environment. We've definitely seen insider threats in these environments. So you're not immune to that either, where you have someone who literally comes in with a USB and maybe there's something malicious on that USB that they're plugging into an HMI or other device. So again, all these things, they really are the basics, and it's not to downplay it, but it's things that people really need to be thinking about, not just for the IT, but for OT.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on one thing that I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier as well. As you build these incident response plans, you need to be exercising it, right? I mean, that's the biggest thing because you're going to go into this and you're going to be hair on fire and you're not going to be 100% sure what you've got to do where. So you've got to make sure that you go through that. Like you can have all the greatest controls, everything in place, and all those types of things. And if you don't have some type of strategy or plan that you've actually gone through and made some muscle memory with, it becomes very difficult to do troubleshooting when you're panicking, right? Everybody makes bad decisions when you panic. And sometimes that can be worse than just even shutting down what you need to. You can truly cause more complicated problems than what you started with if you don't logically think through steps and really build that muscle memory. And those tabletop exercises are a big piece of that. And I know that's something that you all have helped with. It's something that I've been a participant in the past as part of the services that Dragos does, and it's stuff that we do as well here at Broadleaf to make sure that we're allowing organizations to get a good understanding of, yeah, all right, you've got a defensible architecture, you're doing the things you need to do, and now we can really talk about the people part of the equation, not just the tech.
Yep, exactly. And on the people talk of the equation, one other thing I'll point out is just conducting tabletop exercises. So we're really looking at, how prepared are you for an incident? If something were to go boom, how do you react in those scenarios? Do you have the proper mechanisms in place to not only respond, but do you have all your security gaps plugged? And if you don't, what do those
Yep.
security gaps look like today?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, let's hop on to the next one. Yeah, so this one here is kind of talking a little bit more about just the patching and different things that we see in the environment. And for me, I mean, we've touched on this a whole bunch of different times about what you need to do to protect the IT side of the house, and it's always patch, 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 patch. But you've hinted at this a little bit. How is this a little bit different in the OT side of space?
Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of folks know this, but for those who don't or are new to OT, it's usually pretty taboo to patch or push a patch. It's not always feasible in these environments. It's having to shut something off and on again multiple times to apply a patch. In certain cases, you may have vendors who don't necessarily have patches readily available in a timely manner or at all when they push out their advisories. So that leaves you in a bit of a predicament there. And each year we kind of total up these stats, if you will, around vulnerabilities with regards to ICS OT. And last year was no different as far as how high the stats were, where we saw all OT related advisories that went out, whether it be National Vulnerability Database or CISA's ICS advisories. All in all, we saw 74% of those advisories had a patch. And again, if we talk about that not always being a feasible solution or mechanism to approach vulnerabilities in OT, that leaves quite a bit of folks in a predicament when it comes to just the sheer number that fall into that category. And then on the opposite side of that, we had about 26% of advisories that we saw went out with no patch announced. So
Yeah.
that leaves you between a rock and a hard place, right? Not able to really have practical guidance to address those. And Stephen, I don't know what you've seen from kind of like your vantage point, but that mitigation guidance and having something practical to put in place really does make a difference.
Oh yeah, I was actually having a conversation at lunch yesterday with an organization that was kind of lamenting this exact thing, right? They have quite a few PLCs that they had in their environment, and the the IT manager that I was speaking with was like, it's fantastic that y'all are sending me vulnerability notices on these things, but then y'all aren't patching them. So thanks, but thanks. Trying to really figure out what you can do with it at that point in time. And it was a pretty drawn out conversation. And we talked probably for 45, 50 minutes just about different things that they're doing in their environment to really try to take care of these devices that they can't easily go replace, one, because of the capital cost, right? So they know that they have vulnerable devices in their environment. And on top of it, they have to figure out mitigating or compensating controls to go around those devices to be able to make sure that somebody gets in the environment, they can't cause damage or issues. And probably one of the biggest things that I can tell you is going back to that previous consulting engagement I mentioned earlier. We had a gas chromatograph that was installed in this midstream installation, right? So they were doing some distillation of product and they were analyzing the gases that are coming off that frac tower. And I walked in a little blast bunker where they were having a different piping and everything going in, and it was running Windows 98 on the machine that was sitting in there. It was a nice 486, so it was well more than 25 years old. And the gas chromatograph that was sitting right next to it was about the same vintage and about the same age. And I turn and look at my customer at that point in time. I'm like, you do realize that's like 20 years out of date? He goes, yeah, but what you don't realize is that one analyzer is almost $4 million, and if we wanted to replace it, we'd have to shut the plant down, and that would cost a lot more than $4 million. So right now we have 5 of those exact same machines, the PCs that are there, and if it goes down, we quickly plug another one back in and we go about our day. I stopped and thought about it for a minute, and I'm like, okay, yeah, this really is a completely different world. You can't just turn something off and it be fine for 10 minutes and turn it back on. So definitely
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, to your point, you're working with what you have, the means that you have, and a lot of this legacy equipment just is not easy to work with in that way. So, really having to understand that side of things, that world a bit more, and empathize with those challenges is, I think, really important. I can attest to this was probably 4 or 5 months ago. I was on a call with someone who was an IT manager trying to manage OT as well. And he basically said, we have all these vulnerabilities in OT and they need to be patched. I said, I really hope you're not saying that to those on the plant floor. And he's like, I am. And they're pound sand, more or less. And I said, well, that's why you probably shouldn't be saying that. And so I kind of started to walk him through, there's different approaches, different ways to look at this. It doesn't necessarily have to be pushing a patch. There are alternative, stop gaps you can apply, mitigation guidance you can apply. We talked
Yep.
a lot at length about that, and that's really the key there is you don't always have to rely on a patch in these instances. There are practical things you can do in lieu of patch, and that's something we definitely try to take that lens, that approach with all of the clients that we work with, and have that kind of hand-holding conversation and help try and broker, again, like the IT-OT relationship there.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So this one, when we were building this deck and we were kind of talking back and forth, and I mentioned this to you as we've kind of walked through everything. This one really actually surprised me more than probably it should have. I mean, I kind of in the back of my mind knew that this was as bad as it was, but I didn't really want to admit it at first. I mean, over 92% of, POCs that are out there actually, or sorry, exploits that are out there actually have POCs that are publicly available on the internet. That to me is staggering. And it's one of the things that just overly highlights the reason why we have to be proactive in what we're doing and trying to take care of these issues, either through compensating controls, having a defensible architecture, patching when it's applicable, those types of things. It's just, I mean, it's astounding as far as the number of these that are out there. And that goes back to the whole knowledge sharing thing we talked about in the beginning, right? These folks are sharing the knowledge and they're creating these POCs, uploading them somewhere where it's easily accessible, be it on, through a Google search or if it's somewhere on the dark web somewhere. It's just available to them, and it makes these type of attacks or any type of attack much easier for them, right? They don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and while I don't like playing into the whole, AI, relic and talk, I think there's a valuable point to be made there. And I think you brought it up earlier around AI and its use for trying to exploit systems and devices and understand different techniques that are out there. I mean, you could technically go to AI today, a chat GPT, what have you, and start researching, what vulnerabilities are out there for XYZ devices. And then you could take that one step further and see if it can prompt and tell you, hey, which one of those has a public proof of concept vulnerability that exists. So that goes a long way in being able to not only do that research, but make that research more accessible and easier, and scalable for these bad actors. And that's frankly where we see a lot of the trends going is they're going to be using the same tool sets everyone else is using out there that's trying to make life easier, but it's also going to be making things so much easier so that it's making lives more complicated when it comes to the
Right.
different attacks we're seeing. And you're right, that 92% is a very staggering number, and it's something that folks should be concerned about, because if you've heard any of the things we've talked about so far today, a lot of the things being targeted, whether it's internet facing devices or known exploitable vulnerabilities, it comes back to some of these key trends, vulnerabilities being one of the trends.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's kind of leads us perfectly into the next slide as well. So we can, I'm sure that most of the folks that have worked in the OT space that are on this call have seen some type of reference diagram that mirrors this, right? So this is the general consensus around what the Purdue model is. And it's something for me that I've actually been surprised multiple times having conversations with pretty large organizations, and they don't really even follow some of even the basic guidance that here. So for me, this is one of those first questions that I have is, okay, explain to me what your border between your control system environment and your IT environment looks like. And then also, as you get a little bit further in, let's walk through the rest of the different layers of the onion when you're there. And I mean, it's definitely a very powerful tool. It really does give you kind of good guidance of what you need to do. It's not super prescriptive of saying, thou shalt do this and this and this and this, but it really just gives a good talking point and a good opening dialogue with the customer to be able to say, okay, how closely are you following this? How much are you actually making this defensible? Is that kind of the same stuff that you're seeing at Dragos?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, when we have conversations around threats to OT and the perimeter edge facing devices, it's funny. I think you and I talked about this yesterday, but a lot of folks, look at this and say, is this how my network should look? And I'm always kind of laughing, half laughing, because no, like this is obviously just a conceptual diagram of OT and
Right.
IT. And we know there's a lot of crosstalk between those environments, and there may be more IT embedded in OT than what you even see depicted here. And in most cases, there is. And we're seeing a lot of, again, targeting when we talk about perimeter facing devices here, bordering the enterprise. And you can see how close these environments are, how connected they are. And a lot of the threats really are transcending from IT into OT. Even when we look at the more sophisticated threat actors we've seen over the last year, if you're familiar with, Volt Typhoon, we track that as Volt Site here at Dragos. That's one group in particular where we saw a lot of targeting from IT trying to get into OT. One incident in respect to that particular technique and targeting, we actually had the group banging at the door of the OT environment of an entity. So they had gotten through into IT, into the DMZ, and they were basically sitting like right above OT, quite literally trying to get in the door. And I think that leads us kind of all the way back to, again, talking about what are the common things you can do to prevent these types of activity. And the reason that particular group was not able to breach into OT, into that entity, was because they were trying to do the basic 5 things. They were trying to make sure they had an OT incident response plan in place. They had a defensible architecture. They had secure remote access. They had visibility, and they had a risk-based vulnerability management program. So all those things were milestones they were working towards to make sure their OT was resilient. And while unfortunately their IT got compromised, and there's probably work to be done there, it did speak volumes to what the crew on the OT side was doing to lock that environment down.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to me because those same 5 critical controls that you're mentioning, and we've touched on these a little bit along the way. From an IT practitioner's perspective, those are really valuable on all sides of the organization, right? It's not just for OT only. It's really just good common guidance, and it helps with that cyber hygiene and making sure that what you have, you can protect. So it's definitely interesting. And then kind of one of the other pieces that you mentioned on that is the risk-based patching program and trying to understand what you can do around that. So you want to walk us through a little bit with those types of things?
Yeah, for sure. So when we look at having a risk-based vulnerability management program, the Dragos philosophy, if you will, is breaking it into what's called now, next, never approach, where now are the most immediate vulnerabilities that you should be addressing at this very moment. They're immediate action. They have a public proof of concept that exists. They're being actively exploited by an adversary. They may have the potential for operational impacts. So all those things are at play when we're looking at a now or critical set of vulnerabilities. And you can see here over the last year, we only had 6% that fell in that category. So if you're having a conversation with members, stakeholders in your organization, especially executives, and you're trying to say, these are key milestones we're working towards, and hey, only, 6% of the vulnerabilities out there in the environment are critical, that speaks volumes to, oh, that's pretty good. We're not doing too bad. Whereas when you move into that next category, next is really meant to be, these are exploitable vulnerabilities. They should still be taken seriously. But at this time, we don't see any direct operational impacts, but there's something you need to address when you're going through your next sort of, security kind of measurements across your environment, your next scheduled downtime. If you have a patching cycle, that's when you should look to address those next set of vulnerabilities, and you can kind of chunk those up, if you will, because they do fall into more of that middle tier. Again, not immediate action, but something to address in the near term if you can. So 63% fall into that category. And again, you can address these through mitigating controls like network segmentation, multi-factor authentication, making sure your firewall rules are configured properly. So there's stopgaps you can put in place that don't necessarily result in you having to patch all 63% of those. And then that never category, which is also kind of an interesting thing in itself, is I don't think anybody would sit here and say, I never thought I'd look at a set of vulnerabilities and say, I never have to worry about these, right? Because at least from when I worked on the IT side, all vulnerabilities mattered. All vulnerabilities were
Yep.
treated the same. And so when you look at this kind of approach, it's a bit more feasible. It's easier to kind of bite off bits and pieces of this type of kind of programmatic approach to risk-based vulnerability management. And looking at never means, they could eventually be exploited, sure. But at this time, we're not seeing any signs of exploitation or operational impacts as a result of these vulnerabilities. So we usually say monitor for signs of exploitation, because that's exactly what we're doing when we look at these CVEs, if there are changes in them. So this is kind of a good way to take that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, you touched on it a little bit, but if you go to your board or go to your executive leadership and say, hey, I only have 6% of the stuff that's in my environment that I know that I need to get remediated immediately, that makes you look pretty decent, right? I mean, it's like you're covering the majority of the assets that are out there, and you're having that conversation. You can walk them through what needs to be done. And then when it comes time to go back and actually do the steps and replace the equipment, if that's the case, and for that other 63% that's outside of having all the compensating controls pieces in place, it's a little bit easier to talk about cash and capital outlay when you're actually able to articulate, all right, well, we've taken care of the stuff that's on fire. We understand that it's handled, it's solved. And there's that trust that's built by doing that. They understand that such a small slice of what the environment was. You could articulate the impact of the environment, what it would cause the business, and also what their cash outlay was to eliminate those types of things. And then that pulls you into full circle back to being able to go through the items that fall in that next category. So this guidance can be used not just in a programmatic way to make sure we're addressing what needs to be done, but it also is a great talking point when you're, bubbling this up to executive leadership or to your board if you're a, C-level executive. And I know that's the one biggest thing that folks that are at the C-level and they're wanting to have these conversations, and they know that there's going to be money that's outlaid. It definitely is a difficult conversation unless you can justify the cost of the business or the savings to the business or the cost avoidance or whichever way you want to articulate that to be able to illustrate the point. This isn't one of those tools that you can take and say, all right, well, this gives me a roadmap, one, and two, I can actually talk to this and look pretty decent about what I'm doing and be able to actually get additional funding to take care of the other items that are in my environment.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just kind of, close out with, I talked to a good amount of manufacturers that this is one of their top use cases or priorities for OT, if you will. So it's A, having that asset inventory, but B, really it's that vulnerability management aspect. We know there's vulnerabilities out there. How do we address those? How do we prioritize those? And again, taking that programmatic approach and just being able to break it into these bite-sized chunks and having an approach that you're using or a framework that you're using that makes sense for your environment, that's really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I know we've got a couple questions that are here, so I guess we'll jump into those. So if we can highlight up the question from Randy, we'll answer that one real quick. Well, I'll go ahead and just read it off. So Randy had asked the questions: what are the biggest cybersecurity challenges facing legacy operational technology systems and how can organizations secure them without disrupting critical processes? So I think we've kind of touched quite a bit on this one little piece. I'd say probably the biggest challenges facing these types of things is obviously you have older equipment, you have things that can't go down, that can't be repeatedly powered on, powered off for patching. And then also a lot of the tools and techniques, the things that we're using in the IT side of the house don't necessarily play nice with the stuff on the OT side of the house. So you have to really learn a little bit more about what the environment is that you're trying to go and protect, and that's where you really eliminate the disruptions to that side of the business. It's about understanding how the control systems work and how you can then go and protect those assets.
Yeah, and on that point, just kind of rounding out the answer to the question there, one of the common things we see a lot of clients we work with do is try and do an architecture review. So we'll sit down and try and go through and say, what does your environment actually look like? Try and map that out before we go anywhere further, right? Trying to understand what are the legacy systems and devices, where are the potential gaps, and where should you start focusing? Because again, some of these environments can be completely massive, enormous as far
Oh
as how
yeah.
many and assets we see in the thousands, right? So trying to wrap your hands around that can be a big problem set. But again, it's all in how you break up that problem set and attack it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of an interesting point when you really stop and think through about it. It's like a lot of times there's not network diagrams that show specific what's in these environments either, especially as there's been sprawl, right? The IT team has come in and plugged all their stuff in that they wanted to have, like we were talking yesterday, and you'd mentioned that one of the things that actually kind of made you laugh when you're looking at some of the threat intelligence feeds coming back in is you were seeing that there was SIP traffic on the control system network. It's like, okay, that probably shouldn't be in there. So having that understanding of what's in the environment, either through it doing like an assessment, like what you're talking about, coming in and actually understanding and learning about the architecture, learning about what's plugged in where, and then understanding the connectivity between these different things, like process control environments, and several of them that I've been in, they'll have a central location, and then you'll have periphery plants that may be geographically separated by 20 miles, and they're connected through a radio link, and you're looking at all of the stuff that's going on in both of those locations. And unless you understand that something that's this far upstream that physically is separated actually can impact the process down on the other side of the plant, and you don't have direct line of sight visibility on it, it makes it a little bit more challenging to really get your arms around. So it's like you've got to spend time with those engineers that built this entire behemoth to understand what happens where.
Exactly.
No. All right. So the next one we've got here is from Nicole, and she asked, out of the industries in OT, which industry seems to be more likely affected than others by these attacks? And for me, I think it's just everybody that has equipment. We kind of talked a little bit about that. It's not, they don't, threat actors don't really care who they're going after. It's, they want to find what they can exploit.
That's my kind of my favorite question, not to pick on your question, Nicole, but I find it interesting because a lot of folks that typically don't come maybe from like the intel side of things and are just trying to get their hands around, am I vulnerable? Do I have potential threats coming my way? When you look at it for kind of table stakes and what it's worth, nobody's safe. And I hate to say it that way, but nobody is safe. These actors are opportunistic, and we've seen them target every single industry. I mean, we have reports that come out on everything from energy to oil and gas to manufacturing, and that breaks into food and beverage, chemical, pharma. We see things against mining and telcos. There's so much OT out there across the various industries, and a lot of the systems and devices can be very similar in nature and how they operate and the processes in which they're trying to operate under. These actors are opportunistic, and they are going after what is a low-hanging fruit to them. And if they can spin off an exploitation campaign like we talked about here today with the Cyber Avengers Group, you could easily see that started in water, wastewater, and then immediately expanded out to virtually all the different industries, core industries that are out there, if you will. So again, just kind of keeping an open mind when you think about different threats. Just because they're not targeting you today or you haven't seen reflections of that activity against your industry today doesn't necessarily mean you're safe.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of the way that I've explained this before to a couple different boards is, trying to turn it more into their language than the IT technical language about some of the stuff is, okay, well, that's the return on the threat actor's investment, right? So financially, they're either having to pay time for these tools or they're going to have to physically purchase these tools. So are they going to limit themselves to a single set of targets that they're going to say this one tool only works here? Or are they going to go and find something that's got a much higher return on their investment? And if in such, then you're like, okay, that makes a lot of sense because fundamentally, if they're going to go spend $25,000 to learn how to be able to do X, and they can go and exploit a couple $1 million out of people, they're going to do that. And they're not going to care who they're going after.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Looks like we have a question here from Kalhara. It says, what are the most effective strategies you've seen for integrating IT and OT threat intelligence to improve overall incident response, especially with environments with limited visibility into legacy OT assets? You want to take a first whack at that one and I'll follow up?
Yeah, sure. And I love this question just because I'm an Intel nerd. But what I've seen work really well is being able to integrate any intelligence into a centralized repository, because you're going to have IT feeds you're currently consuming. OT threat intel, I hate to say it, is few and far between. Dragos is one of the only ones out there that's actually pushing out credible OT threat intelligence, and that is our core focus. And integrating those sources into a single pane of glass, whether that be a threat intel platform or a SIM, or overall your SOC operations, is ideal for enabling further investigative efforts like incident response investigation, and even going as far as being proactive and doing proactive threat hunting. So a lot of the, I would say, more mature clients we work with that have a full-blown SOC, if you will, and are trying to lead from that end when it comes to collaborating across ITOT. So they're trying to stand up what we call a joint ITOT SOC of some sort. A lot of those folks are extremely successful as they bring in intelligence from those various sources. They try to put it into a centralized repository. And then they have Intel folks and folks from different industries with that subject matter expertise to say, this is what we should be looking for or looking at. And this is the type of activity that is either malicious, nefarious, or maybe it's, to Stephen's point earlier, a misconfiguration. Not everything has to be a bad actor doing something malicious or nefarious or malware related or things of that nature. It could be as simple as the SIP error codes like we were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you kind of touched on something that I like to highlight here as well as we have our conversations with our customers is realistically, if you have all that threat intelligence, you've got things that are happening in both sides of the organization, and if you can centralize that data and put it into one place, that kill chain that we saw a couple of slides ago, you're able to actually demonstrate what that looks like through the entire life cycle of that event, right? If you have your two environments isolated and you understand there's been an event in IT and then there's an event that happens in OT, but you can't figure out the correlation between those two things, it makes it very difficult to actually go through and action the resolution of that problem. So having the data in hand to be able to actually kind of storyboard together to work through those types of problems is a really, really good thing to do. And like you mentioned, it's a lot of the mature organizations are doing. So it's one of the questions that I have as I go along. All right, are you all actually pulling all this intelligence together? And then what are you doing with that intelligence once you have it? Because that threat data that you've got that's there, plus the analytics from the environment, can actually be used in your tabletop exercises as well, right? So you can take real life data, things that are going on in your environment, and tailor that, and you can actually have detailed history about what's there and show how the connectivity works, storyboard something out, and then it becomes very powerful because it's not just a hypothetical. This is like what can literally happen in your environment. Cool. Well, I don't see we have any other questions at the moment, so we'll give everybody another minute or two if they wanted to ask any other questions. But definitely enjoyed the time today. I think as we got prepared for this one, we've talked quite a bit back and forth, and both Liz and I are definitely available to have conversation with folks outside if they would like to have a conversation. But oh, there's one here from Mr. Warden, and I'll let you take that one, Liz.
Yeah. So, how are you seeing organizations most frequently address OT cybersecurity, hiring specialists, cross training IT cyber personnel, or engaging partners to assist? So we see a whole lot of everything, but I think the key trend we see is there's always a problem of lack of resources, lack of personnel, because OT tends to be still pretty niche, even though it's grown over the last several years, I would say. It's garnered more interest, if you will, and more attention, especially when we look at kind of like the higher echelon of compliance initiatives and things that have come out directly from federal government, whether it be against utilities or oil and gas and so on and so forth. There's still always that resource and training gap that we end up seeing. So at the end of the day, when we see people trying to address those issues, they're either trying to do some level of staff augmentation, maybe leaning on a partner. Um, they're also trying to find different system integrators to help with their SOC strategies and build out and manage and run things in their environment on their behalf. So leaning on folks like that. And then obviously from more so of a vendor perspective like Dragos, they're looking to get, tech in the door, and it's all about people, processes, and technology at the end of the day.
Yep.
So those three core values, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we're seeing too, right? It's literally trying to figure out having the right people in the right place, being able to make sure that people are trained and skilled up. And there's still a bunch of open positions. There's still that massive shortage of talent, and that's where partnering up with obviously us here at the Broadleaf Group or partnering up with Dragos is one of those things where you can really use the expertise that's there and understand. So that I see we have one follow-up question from Kahara. I'll quickly touch on that one just because I know we're almost at time. But he's asking kind of, can we elaborate a little bit more on specific observability capabilities that are most critical to implement in remote OT facilities or in remote OT environments? And I'll take a whack at this one just because I know I've seen a little bit of this and using y'all's tool set specifically. So typically on a lot of those kind of deployments, there's sensors that go in, and those sensors are providing that observability data, and they're actually able to kind of pare down. So it's not as verbose as if you're doing like an IPS, IDS in an IT environment. It's not just constantly dumping a span connection all the way through. It's a lot more limited on the level of traffic and the volume of data that moves up. So it makes it a little bit easier over constricted bandwidth and things along those lines in remote locations.
The other thing I would say on that is don't always base everything off anomaly detection. That is one way of doing
Yep.
detection. And generally the ideal way is kind of looking at it in a four-pronged approach. So there will be anomalies, but there's also things like threat behaviors, which have higher fidelity on them. So the different tactics, techniques, procedures associated with threat activity, as well as looking at misconfigurations across the environment, like we talked about the SIP error codes, and then as well as looking at indicators of compromise. There's a variety of ways to look across the environment and even baseline that environment to say, this is what good looks like against what a change looks like in the environment. And having
Exactly.
in mind as you build out and prioritize these different programs is highly important. And then Stephen, as you mentioned, visibility is first and foremost. You can't do anything without visibility. So that's kind of the first part of that. And then trying to decide, are you going to prioritize vulnerabilities next, or are you going to start looking at more of the detection side of things? So
Awesome. Well, I think that's probably it, and we're at time. But I just want to, thank everybody that was on the call today, and Liz, obviously, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I've definitely enjoyed the conversation, and especially the several over the last month and a half as we've gotten ready with this. So I just want to say thanks.
thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks for the collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Talk to you all later.